Hello and welcome to a Slice of Medieval Christmas special. This is actually our fourth Christmas special, which is, I think, pretty impressive that Derek and I are still actually talking to each other as well as doing a podcast together. We've done over a Slice of Medieval has been running for over 3 years now, and I have to say thank you to everybody who has stuck with us from the very beginning and who we've picked up along the way. It's been great fun, and hopefully we'll carry on for years and years to come. Derek's frowning. It does get harder to decide what to do for Christmas every year. Our first Christmas, we did Who Do We Invite to Christmas Dinner, which there was some disagreement, but I got my way with Nicola de la Haye, so I was happy. Our second Christmas was with Matthew Harvey and Stephen A. Mackay over at Rock, Paper, Swords, discussing writing, podcasting, and all the joys of history. And last year, we had Tony Mount join us to give us a rundown of what was involved in a medieval Christmas. And this year, well, what shall we do this year? Having just celebrated our 80th episode, 80 episodes. How about a bit of nostalgia? So Derek and I are going to have a little look back at some of our personal favourite episodes. And I'm going to start right back at the very beginning. Episode 1. 3rd of September 2022. We published our very first episode on the anarchy. Looking back, it's a little bit rough around the edges. I wasn't used to podcasting and didn't even have a decent microphone. Apologies for the sound. And my Yorkshire accent came out a little bit more than it does these days. But I was hooked and I thoroughly enjoyed the whole process. I wasn't sure how long we would carry it on for. I thought, give it 6 weeks and we'll probably be fed up of it. And over 3 years and 80 episodes later, we're still going. And more people are listening to us. So here's just a little snippet from the anarchy. Do go and have a listen to it, the full length episode, and see how we started.
The anarchy itself, it all started with a shipwreck in 1120. Henry I had 2 children, a boy named William and a daughter named Matilda. Unfortunately, the boy named William, who had been raised to be king, he had had the best education, was well looked after, and apparently was a paragon of virtue. I think that might have been a little bit coloured over, but he was supposed to be everything that would be great in a king. Unfortunately, he got on a ship where he got his sailors drunk and they ran aground, and he and 300 souls, I think it was, drowned.
Something like that, yes.
Drowned off the coast of France. And suddenly Henry I was in the middle of a nightmare. He'd lost his only son. His wife had died 2 years before, and he needed an heir. So he married a lady named Adeliza of Louvain. And although they were married for nearly 15 years, he never managed to get Adeliza pregnant, despite the fact he'd had at least 20 illegitimate children. So he knew what
he'd had a lot of success, hadn't he, really, outside of marriage?
Just not with his wife. So poor Adeliza did get a lot of blame for that as well. And yet in her next marriage, she had 5 or 7 children or something. She had a lot of children with her second marriage, so it wasn't her fault.
Wow, I was going to ask you that actually, whether it was likely to be her, but obviously it wasn't. So the chemistry wasn't there. The chemistry wasn't there, or the biology wasn't there. Something wasn't there.
Yeah, obviously a compatibility issue. So I think he started grooming Stephen of Blois, whose name I can never pronounce.
No, it's a struggle, that word, isn't it? I've always had trouble. Blois, yeah, it's sort of
And I can't pronounce it. It just sounds like I'm throwing up.
Yeah, let's not keep that image. Or perhaps we should.
So Stephen of Blois, and see what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, however many times you try to say it, it's not going to get any easier.
No, it doesn't. So yeah, I think he started grooming Stephen to take his place. But then in 1125, everything changed again because his daughter Matilda's husband died in Germany. She had nothing to keep her in Germany. She wasn't going to be regent or anything. So she could come back to England and therefore she could be Henry's heir.
There was a tiny flaw, though, wasn't there, in her being the heir?
Yes, she was a woman. And apparently, I think she was probably a really strong and would have been a very capable queen. But as far as the men was concerned, she was a woman. And that's a big problem. She had to be married. She had to have a man to help her because men are so helpful and women can't do anything without a man helping them. And Henry, for some reason, Henry I chose Geoffrey of Anjou to be her husband, to help her when she came to be the crown. The problem with choosing Geoffrey was nobody liked him. I don't get it. I don't get why he chose somebody that his barons did not like and saw him as somebody who would encroach on their own lands. But I suppose he couldn't choose a vassal, which is what Elizabeth I used to say. She couldn't marry somebody who was her subject.
Yeah.
So Henry had to find somebody who wasn't going to be Matilda's vassal.
Well, their marriage, it got off to a bit of a rocky start, didn't it?
It got off to a really bad start. She left him the year afterwards, 2 years afterwards. She actually, I think he was hitting her or something. So she left him because Geoffrey was only, what was he, 14 or 15 or something when he married her, and she was 10 years older than him.
Yeah,
so
something like that.
She married to a child isn't going to help either. So she left him and went back to her father's court for about a year. So then you have this thing where she's persuaded eventually to go back. I don't know if she's persuaded or threatened, but eventually she does go back to Geoffrey and they're reconciled. And a son is born shortly afterwards, Henry. Who,
they must have been very reconciled then.
They must have been as well, because it wasn't just Henry. They had 3 boys very quickly. Within 4 years, she'd had 3 children. Unfortunately for her, the birth of the second one, Geoffrey, was really difficult and it took her a long time to recover. Well, actually, she had recovered and had fallen pregnant again. And then her dad died. And she was in Anjou, pregnant and probably still poorly from having given birth to Geoffrey, with 2 toddlers around her. And her dad dies and she's supposed to claim the throne, but she can't because she's a mother. So Stephen takes advantage of that and claims the throne for himself. And you just think, that's sort of probably, you can imagine all the barons going, see, that's what we were trying to tell you.
Yeah. Actually, it is, yeah. I mean, that's sort of life in a sense, isn't it? You can't rule if you're a woman because you've got to have kids and all the rest of it. So yes, it sort of bore out the reasons for their objections, but they had sworn an oath to support her.
Yeah, they'd sworn 2 oaths by that point. They'd done it twice. They did it as soon as she came back from Germany, and then I think after she married Geoffrey, there was another oath. They'd definitely sworn twice, and Stephen had sworn it as well. So he was breaking his oath by claiming the crown.
My first choice is episode 36. One writer we were thrilled to have as a guest was David Gilman. David's screenplay and writing credits are second to none, so it's no surprise that his historical fiction series, set during the 100 Years' War, is a tour de force. He took time out to tell us where the inspiration for his hero, Thomas Blackstone, came from, and also talked about the 100 Years' War as a historical setting for his novels.
We have a wonderful treat today with a very special guest, David Gilman. His Master of War series is, quite frankly, incredible. Set in the 100 Years' War, it follows the adventures of Thomas Blackstone. Welcome, David, and congratulations on the latest book.
Well, thank you very much. Nice to be here.
To Kill a King is the 8th book in the Master of War series. Can you give us a brief review of Thomas Blackstone's career so far?
Oh, right. Well, it goes back. Let's see. He's about 20 years on now, I suppose, from when we started. He was a 16-year-old stonemason who cared for his brother, who was, if the terminology is probably not correct these days, but he was deaf mute. Big lumbering child who was used for all kinds of things except conversation and anything else, and he was accused of rape. And with Thomas Blackstone being his guardian, they both would have hanged had they been convicted. So off they went to war. And this was 1346. So we're now in where are we now? 1367. So he's come a long way. He started off as an archer. And the reason is, I think I started him at that age. I wanted a reader to get a sense of obviously the time, but also that a 16-year-old going to war and the effect it had on him. So through the eyes of a 16-year-old, that first conflict, what it meant, and I think that worked. I hope that worked, and so it went on from there. But at the Battle of Crecy, in trying to save his brother, he actually rescued the Prince of Wales, who was in the vanguard of the battle and who was the same age as Blackstone. Very conveniently, might I add. So he saves him, and he suffers terrible wounds. He really nearly dies on the battlefield. And the King Edward, who was there, of course, said to his son, well, you know, this guy saved your life. He needs to be honored. So they knighted Blackstone as a 16-year-old. And then he went into his recovery. So that was the start of his time, as it were. He was then trained into sword fighting, and then men came to him, and slowly but surely he built up this group of men around him, and he was quite defiant of the king. There wasn't a lot more to do at that stage with the Prince of Wales, and then as time went on, he became so efficient as a leader, a commander of these men, never more than about 100. I always kept it quite low numbers. That he was made eventually King Edward's Master of War. And that has taken the story on and on and on through the conflicts of that period of the 100 Years' War. And that's where it started. And I was only going to write one book.
Yeah, so I was going to say, did you intend a series or...
No, one book, that was it. And then I was going to go and do something else. So then they said, well, hang on a moment. We continue. So here I am. So that's the 8th book done. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the real characters in it is Edward the Black Prince. And he features quite a bit in To Kill a King and the earlier books. What is your take on him? Was he a great general or was he overhyped?
I don't think he was overhyped. You've got this strange contradiction going on at this period of time. You know, these were very pious men. They prayed, they acknowledged their successes to God, they gave to the poor, they had chivalric feelings about everything, but they were also terribly brutal when it came to fighting. And when you think that this 16-year-old Prince of Wales at the Battle of Crecy, let's start there, at the Battle of Crecy in 1346, he actually was in the vanguard of the battle. And it was a heck of a battle. And when it looked as though he was about to be overpowered, history tells us that they went to the king and said, look, shouldn't we sort of send a few more reinforcements down to help him out there? And the king said, well, you know, he's got to take his chances. And so that tells me there's enormous guts and courage that you stand there and you do that. And as time went on, and don't forget, he then went on and beat the French at Poitiers and captured the French king. He was a good soldier and very brave, I think. And there's always going to be conflicting reports about him, you know. So no, I don't think he was overhyped at all.
My next choice is, well, I thought was a rather poignant episode, episode 35, looking into the Black Death with novelist S.D. Sykes. We had just come through a pandemic ourselves, and I thought we had a lot more understanding of what medieval people went through in the 14th century with the Black Death than we would have done in 2018 or 2019. We could certainly draw parallels, and we did in this episode. Of course, we knew it was only a matter of time before a vaccine was created. In the 14th century, they had no such hope of salvation. And S.D. Sykes told us how they dealt with that and how it affected everyday life.
I think it resonates very much with the modern day experience of the pandemic as well.
I think I understand it a lot better now because of what we went through.
Yeah.
Author S.D. Sykes is joining us to talk about her series, which is set during the 14th century plagues in Britain. It's a wonderful subject, and I do like the way you combine the plague and murder mysteries. What made you set your stories in the time of plague?
Okay, so I think anything that is a natural, well, yeah, it's a natural disaster in the way that the plague was, is kind of an irresistible setting for a writer, particularly if you like that kind of slightly gothic feel, and nothing, it doesn't come much more gothic than the plague. It was such a pivotal moment in our history. I really believe that. It killed 50% of the population in England, and therefore it had such long-ranging effects on society. From all sorts of things, from the empowerment of the poorer people in society through to, I believe, the Reformation. I think you can trace all of those, and the end of feudalism, all of those things back to the plague. And I think sometimes it's slightly, in history, it's seen as this natural disaster. There's a lot about the etymology of, the actual bacteria that caused the plague and all those sorts of things, without actually an analysis of how it changed society. And we didn't see society collapse. That was the really interesting thing. It carried on, but it just changed. It changed slowly afterwards. So it was a fantastic time for me to set a novel, and also to see if anyone would care about a murder happening when so many people had already died of plague. So that was it, really.
You did get me wondering about how many people did murder people during the plague and got away with it.
Well, yeah, I think that was probably where when I was first starting to think about it. Those are the sorts of questions I was asking myself as a writer. Would anyone care? Who would use that opportunity as a way to disguise what they'd done? It must have happened. Yeah, definitely.
I think you're absolutely right about the effects, because I've just been doing a book on the Wars of the Roses, but in terms of the impact on society, there's nothing like the Black Death at all. It's just so much bigger. It just sort of, everybody questions everything after that.
They do.
So I agree with you. It's just huge in terms of its impact on, well, ordinary people as well as, those who have power.
Yes, I mean, the people in power were very much worried about, the empowerment of the poorer people in society, because of the way it affected their own wealth, their own farms. Suddenly, if you've got a load of people who won't work for you anymore because there's a massive chronic shortage of labour, then that's seriously worrying. And you see post-plague, you see that whole kind of run up to the peasants' revolt, and it wouldn't have happened without the Black Death.
No. In terms of how it affected, it's funny because I was reading The Good Death, knowing that we were talking to you, I was kind of focused on what people thought about it and how it affected them in their everyday lives, because obviously having gone through COVID,
yes,
we might have a few more clues now about how such a sort of pandemic affected people than we previously would have done. What's your take on how it affected their everyday lives?
I mean, during the actual Black Death itself, during the plague, obviously there was panic. There was there was a sort of nihilism as well amongst a group of people. We're going to go out and just party and get drunk, and the world's going to end, so why not? There was that side of things. Then there was a lot of questioning as to what had caused, because they didn't know what. We know it was a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, but they didn't know that. They didn't understand it, what it was at all. So what caused this? So there was great questioning, a great fear. There was all sorts of other talking about COVID, there were all sorts of other comparisons you could say in terms of just daft things like there was the way that we were all rushing out and buying hand gel. Do you remember the hand gel thing? There was a run on gloves before, you couldn't get hold of gloves in London before.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I remember it well.
But then I think you were going to say toilet roll then, were you? Well, I think, that was what was that about? It was a kind of a pointless kind of panic stations. But I think there was all sorts of, depending on your views, there were all sorts of pointless things going on during the plague as well. Some reactions to it, things like, the flagellants, people rushing around the country, sort of beating themselves in the hope that this would somehow stop the plague from happening. And then there was also, people would flee. They understood enough to know that, there's that old thing, but I think it was Hippocrates said, fly quickly, go far, return slowly. And so they started to know that, the best thing to do was to get out of its path if you could.
In episode 29, JustinHill joined us to explain how little is generally known about Harold Hardrada's very exciting and eventful life before he arrived to fight the English at Stamford Bridge in 1066. This episode is packed with really great stories about a man who's often viewed rather one-dimensionally.
Welcome, Justin. He's here today to talk to us about Harold Hardrada, the subject of his 2016 book, Viking Fire. What attracted you to his story?
I was looking at writing a single novel about the Battle of Hastings, and so I thought, well, you can't tell the story of what happened in 1066 without telling the story of what happened in 1016. So this was a series of books that was looking at of telling that story. And the first one starts in the reign of Ethelred the Unready, and it essentially tells the story of how the Vikings conquered England in 1016. And the main character there is Godwin, and that book is called Shield Wall. And I always saw it as a trilogy. And Harold Hardrada, obviously, is the other main character in 1066. You have William the Conqueror, Harold Godwinson, and Harold Hardrada. And in a sense, he's often a kind of a footnote to 1066. Whereas it seems to me, if you were a betting man in 1066, the wise money was on Harold Hardrada. He was by far the most impressive of the three candidates for the throne of England. And so I really wanted to tell his story. And in a way, his story is told because we have the saga, published in English as King Harold's saga, but it's part of the Heimskringla by Snorri Sturluson. And his story is kind of told, but it's told in a way that is very Norway-centric. I think of the 100 chapters in King Harold's saga. The first one, he's a fugitive. The second one, he goes to Russia. And the third one, he goes to Constantinople. In the fifth chapter, and these chapters are prose shorts, really. I mean, they're barely a page long. He's then in Sicily. He's in Sicily until chapter 10. So really, in a book, you kind of up to page 15, and he's already in Sicily. Goes to Constantinople, goes to Jerusalem, is in prison. So by chapter 19, he's back in Norway. And I thought, actually, the way the saga looks at this is completely the wrong way around. The really interesting stuff happens in his early life. And so I set out to do a novel that told that.
He certainly had an interesting early life from the age of about 15 anyway. How did he cope with this experience of having to leave where he was brought up and go to really quite not strange parts of the world, but certainly foreign parts of the world that he wouldn't have been familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, this I think is very interesting because he's a Norwegian Viking, and the Norwegian Vikings, their world was kind of what is now Scotland and what is now Ireland and kind of the Lords of the Isles. So their route to go a Viking was to go westwards, and his half brother Olaf had spent his formative years in England fighting and getting very rich in England and using that wealth to become king in Norway. But the Danish conquest of England by Canute changes that, because Canute is kind of overlord of the north, really, Scandinavia and England, and he's pushing into Norway. And so Canute is coming into conflict with Harold's brother, King Olaf, and that ends up with the Battle of Stiklestad, where Olaf is killed and Harold is wounded and dragged from battle at the age of 15. And so Harold was then forced to take the eastern route of the Vikings. And this was the one that Swedish Vikings would typically take. And it goes down to what is now Russia and Ukraine, or mainly Ukraine. And this is obviously it's kind of not what he's expecting. It's quite a shock. And Ukraine and Russia are no less intimidating kind of a future than they are now. There was a fabulous experiment in about 10 years ago. A guy called Pavel Sabovnikov, and he spent some time in the Russian wilderness living as a kind of 10th century Viking. And there's a great quote about the guy. The guy who was running the experiment said that 8 months was enough for the experiment to yield results, but not so long that it will pathologically endanger the guy taking part. And I thought this is fantastic. So this is the world that Harold Hardrada, 15, he's dragged from battle. He recuperates in a hut, escaping the men who are hunting him down. And the saga says he crosses the Kielback Mountains from Norway into Sweden in the face of winter, makes his way down to the hall of the Swedish king, where he's kind of entertained for a few months, and then sets forth off into what is now Ukraine and down towards Kiev. And it's it's a nascent nation state, and it's based on fur trading and slavery and exploiting the local tribes, so kind of Latvians and Chens and Pechenegs and people. And so, an extraordinary kind of tough childhood, and ends up in Kiev, probably about 19 or 20, already having kind of made a name for himself as quite a leader of a war band. And really, in kind of modern terms, he's kind of the head of a mafia gang, intimidating local tribesmen to give him slaves and furs. I think we're just learning about the Eastern Vikings and just how important they were. The amount of silver that came up, from Baghdad and Constantinople. They were selling slaves to both, the Muslim state and the Christian state. The amount of silver that came up into Europe effectively kind of kickstarts the Middle Ages, and it kickstarts the economy, because there's so much silver that actually you can suddenly have a currency-based economy, which radically transforms Europe. And that's all because of the Vikings and the trade routes eastwards. Hoards that have been dug up in the eastern Baltic, in Sweden and Denmark, are just massive amounts of silver. And it's all coming from Baghdad.
Well, my third choice is episode 21 with Anne O'Brien. Now, when you're a historian, every historian, I should think, has heard of the Pastons and the Paston letters. I haven't had the pleasure of actually studying them myself, but Anne wrote a couple of books on the Pastons and went into great detail in our discussion about this amazing family. The first Valentines were sent by one Paston to another. And Anne O'Brien is one of my favourite guests of all time. She's very easy to talk to, and her insight and knowledge of the Paston family and their letters is encyclopedic. Actually, her knowledge of history, medieval history, is incredible. I highly recommend the other episode we did with her on Roger Mortimer. She's got a very passionate view of history that it's infectious.
It is, yes.
We're joined by best-selling author Anne O'Brien. Anne's last two books, The Royal Game and A Marriage of Fortune, tell the stories of the Pastons, a family whose incredible collection of correspondence sheds a light on the late 15th century and the Wars of the Roses. So when Derek and I decided to do an episode on this prolific letter-writing family, who else would we ask but Anne O'Brien? Welcome, Anne.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with you.
For those listeners who may not have heard of the Pastons, tell us a little about the family.
Well, they were the famous 15th century letter-writing family from Norfolk. And anyone who reads about the Wars of the Roses has to come across them because they are cited as giving information about them. In 1735, the family papers came into public ownership because the heir died without a descendant. He was William Paston, Earl of Yarmouth. And within it, there was a cache of documents. And within that was the Paston letters. And they covered the whole of the 15th century, more or less, ending about 1509. So what did they tell us? It begins with Clement Paston. Now, he didn't write letters at all, and he was little more than a peasant. He took his name from the place he lived, Paston in Norfolk, and he had a small area of arable land and a small watermill with a little river by it, it's described. And he's just a good, plain husbandman. But 2 generations on, the Pastons were a family of means. They had a castle and they were intent on rising even further. And they were writing, and that's the main point about it. So how did they do this? How did they change from being a peasant-based family to being gentry? Partly through education. The sons of the family were sent to Cambridge and to the Inns of Court, and they learnt how to deal with the law, and particularly all the cut and thrust of litigation and legal problems. But I think far more important than that was the marriages they made. And the Paston women, those who married into the family, were far better born than their Paston menfolk. Both Margaret Mortby and Agnes Berry were girls from gentry families, and they were the heiresses. So when they wed into the Paston family, they brought land, they brought good dowries, and they brought connections with other gentry families. And so, of course, the Paston men made the most of these connections. So by the end of the century, the Pastons had earned their place at court. John Paston eventually was made a knight through his work for Henry VII. He fought for him at the Battle of Stoke. And as I said, they owned a castle. And it's all there in the letters. It's amazing. They're vibrant, they are very confrontational, they're exuberant. You can't do better than that. The sad thing is, we have no idea what they look like. There are no portraits, even no physical descriptions from anybody. It's just their voices that are so loud and clear. The one problem for a novelist is so many of them are called John. Margaret's husband, John, and their 2 sons, the 2 eldest sons, were both called John. And history calls them simply John 1, John 2, and John 3. But a novelist can't do that. A novelist has to be a bit more imaginative, which I tried to be. But those are the Pastons, and they're the ones who wrote the letters.
I think we'd all agree that to have such a cache of letters it's so revealing of a group, a family who they're not nobles. And normally you hear about the marriages of the nobles and you understand that that's important, but you don't hear about the marriages of the classes below, which are relatively equally important to their status.
Yes, that's right. It's this middling sort of group of people, and we just don't know for the most part. And if these Paston letters had gone the way of most correspondence, we wouldn't know anything about them either. So how fortunate we were that
Yes.
a historian got his hands on them and saw their value.
My next choice is episode 55, which was something of a departure for us in terms of the subject matter. Dr. Ian Mortimer introduces us to a world where the wheels turn very slowly, literally. The speed of travel and communication was a factor which had a profound impact on every aspect of medieval life. And Ian Mortimer gives us a really good idea of how that worked out for the people of the time.
Dr. Ian Mortimer is joining us, described by the Times newspaper as the most remarkable medieval historian of the time, and the author of the fabulous Time Traveller's Guide and a wonderful biography of Edward III. So when we invited Ian to join us, instead of giving him a topic, we asked, what would you like to talk about? And Ian came up with an intriguing concept, medieval speed. So welcome, Ian. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And so medieval speed, that's about the pace of communication in medieval times, isn't it?
Very much so, yeah. I mean, the reason I pick on speed is because I like to bring out from past evidence those things that are perhaps counterintuitive, which are really surprising, which people perhaps haven't thought of for themselves. And to my knowledge, I only know one scholarly article on speed of travel in the Middle Ages in England. and only a couple of books by European scholars, most of which are very general. And it seems to me a neglected area. And it also seems to me to be vitally important in understanding the whole of society throughout the Middle Ages. So I really wanted to go for this subject because it's going to be thought-provoking, if nothing else.
Absolutely. It affected everything, didn't it? Business, religion, politics.
It affects everything. And in order to understand how it affects, I think you need to know the speeds we're talking about. Most people will think in terms of medieval people either on foot or on horseback, and they will think of relatively poor quality roads because we were still effectively using a late Roman road system in this country through the Middle Ages. And they will think of bad condition roads, horses can't go that fast, carriages really can't go very far at all. Forget all this about the medieval coaching inns, there is no such thing. So you couldn't really easily use a wheel transport long distances. So you've got preconceptions of people on foot who can probably do 20 miles a day. And that, by the way, is enshrined. There is a legal expectation that everybody could travel 20 miles a day in this country. And there is also the idea that people could ride on top of that. Now, people who are familiar with horse riding perhaps think, well, you could do 20 or 30 miles on a horse and then you'd really want to get off and stop. Of course, they could go much further, but it required changes of horses. And as soon as you start telling people about changes of horses, you've gone beyond their expectation of, oh, it's just one person going on a horse. So how fast could people travel? It depends who they are, how much money they got, the reasons for traveling, which time of year it is, all sorts of things. There's a whole gamut of factors. But if you think in broad terms, we have to assess speeds through long distance because we're not able to rely on their times because their methods of timekeeping were sun-based before mechanical clocks. And of course, once we had mechanical clocks, they weren't regulated to the same time. So you can't trust the times over short distances. But what you can do is look at long distances. And it is very, very difficult to find any instances in the 11th or 12th centuries of anybody moving around at much more than 25 miles a day, however wealthy they were. Now, logically, you can see reasons where people had to move very fast. Think of Harold coming back from Stamford Bridge towards Hastings, and he forced his troops to march as fast, really, as they could. They were probably covering 30 to 40 miles a day, as far as you possibly could go as an armoured person on foot. But beyond that, your communications are very limited. When you look at speeds like the Killers of Thomas Becket at the end of in 1170, you can work out that the speeds they must have done in northern France, if they'd sustained them for 24 hours, would have meant they could have done 100 miles in 24 hours. And that's the first indication of prosperous people hitting that boundary of 100 miles a day. If you look then through the 13th century, in the 13th century develop a royal messenger service in this country. And they are of two types. There's a mounted messenger and the foot messenger. And the emphasis in both cases is really to transport information securely and with the king's authority. It's not necessary to go as fast as possible, especially because the horse messenger has to use his own horse. So if he's going to knacker his horse out, he's lost his most valuable asset. So you don't really see speeds hit 100 miles per day regularly until the 14th century. And it's very much then on the continent, because English messengers on the continent didn't have to use their own horses. They could use whatever facilities there were. And because kings, Edward III is a good example, wanted that message to get to the Pope, more often than not, as quickly as possible, they were given a time by which they had to get there and get back. Because obviously Edward III had no idea how long it was going to take him to get there. So he gave them a return time. So his official messengers were given, get to Avignon, deliver this message, and get back here in 18 days on pain of death. It's a bit extreme, really, but on pain of death is what he told his own messengers when he was urgent. And those messengers, we have documentation to show that they were regularly doing in excess of 100 miles a day.
Finally, our absolute favourite guest has to be, well, for me, it's episode 16, when we actually got Bernard Cornwell on the podcast to discuss the Battle of Agincourt. Now, I started reading Bernard Cornwell as a teenager, He's long been my favourite author after Alexandre Dumas, but Alexandre Dumas dead, so he wouldn't come on the podcast. The man is a genius of storytelling, so getting him as a guest on A Slice of Medieval was definitely not just a highlight for the episode, but a career highlight for me. He set the standard for research and authenticity in historical fiction years ago. And I think most of our guests, if not all of them, owe a little bit of their career and inspiration to Bernard Cornwell.
Well, I was certainly inspired to write historical fiction, having read Bernard Cornwell's books. And I think he remains an inspiration to many, many writers. So it was great that he was generous enough to give us some of his time to talk about the book Azincourt and the nature of the battle and the people who took part in the campaign and where he got those people from in some cases. It was really interesting to listen to him, and we're very grateful for him giving us his time.
We have a very special guest today, a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. The creator of Uhtred of Bebbanburg and Richard Sharp. It's a very big welcome to Bernard Cornwell.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks for joining us today, Bernard. So my first question, Bernard, is when you wrote Harlequin, there were not that many novels set during the 100 Years' War. And the Thomas of Houghton books were set in the early period of the war at Crécy and Poitiers. What made you choose that period?
I think it was a fascination with, well, one, the record, of course. I mean, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, that's 3 test matches, one on the road, all on the opponent's territory too. And the longbow fascinated me, totally fascinated me. So I think that was why.
Yeah, the power of the longbow. I've been reading Azincourt this week just to remind myself of it because it's so long since I read it. And it's like the power and the strength that these men must have had in order to draw that bow must have been incredible.
It was incredible. And they found the bones of archers in graves. And their bone structure is unnaturally large. Their bones developed to literally anchor the muscles.
Yeah.
And I've met archers today who can fire a longbow just as effectively as the guys that did at Agincourt. And I mean, their backs are just a mat of muscle.
Mm.
They were extraordinarily strong. And that was one reason why the longbow didn't become, if you like, more widespread.
Mm.
You had to train with it for a very long time. Most English and Welsh archers started at 6 or 7. And by the time they were 16, 17, they were tall enough, strong enough, and skilled enough to shoot it. I mean, the weapon was so efficient that, in fact, the Duke of Wellington, during the Peninsular War, made an inquiry of the War Office in London whether it was possible to have a corps of longbowmen. Because if you put 500 archers from Agincourt up against any battalion of the British Army in 1810, the archers would have won. They're more accurate than a musket, they shoot further than a musket, and they shoot much faster than a musket.
They can fire a lot more arrows in a minute than 3 bullets.
Oh, indeed, yes, and far more accurately. In fact, Ben Franklin said that if the rebels in the American Revolution had had the longbow, the war would have been over in 6 months. So it's a good job they didn't, I suppose.
Yeah.
So the Agincourt campaign, obviously, it's the stuff of legend, and you'd already written about the earlier period. So did you find any difficulty in plotting a story around it and making it perhaps significantly different from the Grail Quest series?
I don't remember that particularly. I mean, I always say that 95% of the work in a novel is finding the story. So I suppose I did, because I always do. But I don't look back on any of those books with any regret. They were difficult to write. Looking in the historical notes at the end of Agincourt, I noticed that you'd used actual archers' names from the battle for a significant number of the characters. Was that something you decided on early on, or did you just decide to do that later? It was either taking players for Liverpool or going back to the original source where we actually do have a list of the names and
Yes.
just plucking the names from that list.
Yes.
There's Tom Scarlett, and Will of the Dale. And I'm there thinking, there's Helena Dale, Will Scarlet in Robin Hood. Were you thinking of Robin Hood?
Did I use those names?
You did.
Yeah.
They're pretty common now, I think.
Yes, they were very common, yes.
I remember I was in a church in Derbyshire somewhere for whatever reason, and we stumbled across this list of people from the village who had been sent to fight, probably in Scotland somewhere. And I thought, there they are. Those people were, real people, not just names, but it's amazing how the names are recorded and live on.
I think we're peculiarly fortunate in Agincourt in having the master rolls.
Yeah.
And an enormous list of names that you can choose from.
Yes, yeah.
And Henry V, he was only king for about, 8 or 9 years?
It was a very short reign, yes.
What do you think of Henry V?
Well, I'm not that fond of him, oddly enough. I mean, I know he's a great English hero, but he was also horribly religious, and I always have a great suspicion of religious fanatics. I mean, I think if I remember Agincourt rightly, it begins with the death of some Lollards being burnt at the stake.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was very much his idea. He was a very, very pious man. And there's probably nothing wrong with that.
So it just remains for Derek and I to wish all our listeners a very Merry Christmas. Next year, we have Nathan Amin joining us. We have a Slice of Medieval Goes Tudor series. And on New Year's Eve, Ian Mortimer is back with us to talk about his A to Z of history. And I think we'll be concentrating on the medieval. And there's some fascinating snippets in there I can't wait to discuss with him. I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas and do join us again for what we have to come in 2026. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I've been Derek Birks. It's a Merry Christmas from her and a Merry Christmas from him. And we hope to have you listening to us in the coming year. Thanks for listening.